Sexuality here on campus at Sonoma State. Thank you for coming tonight to see Leslie Feinberg. First, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Center for Culture, Gender, and Sexuality, and other institutionally related activities, Associated Student Productions, Sonoma Student Union, the Queer Straight Alliance, and the Women's Gender Studies Department. Leslie Feinberg came of age as a young butch lesbian in the factories and gay bars of Buffalo, New York in the 1960s. Since that time, Feinberg has been a grassroots activist and a journalist. Z is known in the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender movements in the United States and countries around the world. Feinberg is a well-known activist who works to forge a strong bond between the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender communities. As a trade unionist, anti-racist, and socialist, Feinberg also organizes to build strong bonds of unity between these struggles and those movements in defense of oppressed nationalities, women, disabled, and the working class movement as a whole. Feinberg's first novel, Butch Blues, which was released in 1993, has received a widely popular response in the United States and has been translated into Chinese, German, Italian, Dutch, Turkish, Slovenian, and Hebrew. Feinberg's historical work, Transgender Warriors, Making History from Joan of Arc to RuPaul, is the first analysis of historical roots of transgender oppression, and Trans Liberation Beyond Pink or Blue contains a compilation of speeches by the author with written portraits of other trans activists. Drag King Dreams, Feinberg's second published novel, was released in March 2006. Feinberg has toured the country speaking at pride rallies and protest marches and at scores of colleges and universities. Currently, Feinberg is a national leader in the Workers' World Party and a managing editor and political journalist of the Workers' World newspaper. Please join me in welcoming Leslie Feinberg.
Thank you for welcoming me. I grew up under such intense hostility and have experienced so much brutality and so much visible despising in my life that I'd never take for granted what it means to walk into a room filled with people that I haven't met yet and be warmly welcomed by you. Thank you. Thank you, Sky, and thank you, Bonnie. Where's Bonnie? Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Bonnie. I know it takes a lot of work to bring us all together in a room like this, but this is the second time that we've worked together, and I have enormous respect for you as a political organizer, as a thinker, and a doer. And you know, the person that you get all the emails from is taking an inordinate amount of weight for organizing on their shoulders, I know. Can you hear me okay back there? Okay. And Simon, I'm really glad you're here tonight. If I were here next week, this is where I'd be. This is where I'd be. Now, I'll tell you, I don't have to be here to be here. I'm going to be in New York, marching on May 1st with undocumented workers and documented workers in support of immigrant rights. And I want to dedicate my talk tonight to that struggle, and I want to explain why. And my whole talk, I think, in a way, is explaining why I'm beginning as a transgender lesbian activist talking about the struggle of undocumented workers. I came out in the gay bars, which were also drag bars. We didn't have the word transgender then, but we also didn't have the word gay then. All the words that we had were words that got hurled out of a window the car window got rolled down and you knew there was a full beer can coming after it, or yes, or worse. And when I came out into those bars, I never could have imagined, in a life that I was leading where it was so isolated, where the terror of just getting from home to my job in the factory, or from home to get a quart of milk, or to be out in public, was such a dangerous thing to do. And why? Why? Because I was masculine female. That's it. That's it. I mean, it was conflated. It was completely equated with same-sex love. But then, why was that a problem? You know, these were things I had to know. This was my life. And anybody could take it from me at any time, any stranger. And in fact, a crowd might even applaud them doing it. I had to know why. And I am so grateful that I came of age in consciousness in the 1960s. First, I'm glad I grew up during the McCarthyite, anti-communist, anti-Jewish, anti-gay witch hunts of the 1950s. So it was an important education. And the 60s didn't just happen after the 50s. The 60s happened because of the 50s. The 60s were a response to the Jim Crow segregation, to the war against the Korean people, to the gay bashing. You know, it wasn't just a red scare in this country, it was a lavender scare too. You know, there were purges going on of gay people. The idea of someone going through sex reassignment was, you know, that person was almost ridiculed out of humanity on mass media, which at that time was mostly the radio, but to some degree television too. And it was out of that period of the civil rights struggles of the 1950s and the growth of the Black Power movement, of the American Indian movement, of the Young Lords, who were the Puerto Rican revolutionary youth, of Irwakun, the Asian militants and revolutionary youth, the women's movement that was coming up, the movement against the war in Vietnam. It was a time of rising social struggle, and that struggle was producing consciousness. And that had a tremendous impact on my life, because I could have walked through the world in another period asking myself the same questions, but not have found the answers. And there's a wonderful, wise proverb that comes from the African continent. I can't tell you which country because it's been lost so far as I know at this point, that says, until the lions come to power, the history of the hunt will glorify the hunter. And I had grown up on the hunter's history. In fact, my high school history teacher was reportedly the leader of the local John Birch Society, which are like, for those who don't know, are like philosophical Nazis in suit and tie, you know. And whether she was or not, she sure could have been, based on the curriculum. So when I got out into the factories and started working when I was like 15, you know, I lied on my work papers because what else was I going to do? I mean, I certainly wasn't going to go to college or university. That was really like another city that I didn't live in and had no way of going in. What would I have done with a college diploma? What would I have done if someone handed it to me? I went into the factories, and I certainly knew there was a war going on, because the women, when we all worked on the line, you know, you noticed when one of the spots was empty, when somebody didn't come in that day. And part of the reason I could get into the factories as a butch lesbian is because there was a war going on, and the men were being shipped off to go kill or be killed. And so that created the space for jobs for people who were more marginally employed in other periods of the economy. So I would say, where's so-and-so today? Didn't you hear she got the word about her son or about her brother? It was mostly younger men at that time. Now it's like all ages are being taken, and if the draft's opened up, that's going to have even more of an impact. And sure enough, I began to hear, it seemed like all the guys in my high school graduating class, black and white. I'd say, where's so-and-so? Oh, didn't you hear? I mean, it was beginning to come home, the war, even to those of us who said to ourselves, They didn't ask me if I wanted this war to start, and they're not going to listen to me if I say I want it to end. My voice doesn't matter. You know, all they ask me is every 4 years they say, do you want this war maker or that war maker? Do you want evil or lesser of two evils? But one day, I left work early sick, and I saw a demonstration coming, marching down Main Street, which had come from the university. And they were chanting something that woke me up. They were chanting, big firms get rich, GIs die. Now that I knew was true. I knew that was the truth, and it spoke to me in a different way. But I didn't know where you went to find out demonstrations were going to happen. I didn't know how you got in the loop for that kind of thing. You know, I just thought, well, I just happened on it, and I'm glad I did, but nobody still wants to hear anything I have to say about whether or not there should be a war. When I first heard about the Stonewall Rebellion, which was in 1969 in New York City, in Greenwich Village, frankly, I was mad as hell that I missed it. Because I was ready to fight, but it just seemed like every time I had an opportunity to fight back, the opportunity kept presenting itself, but it was always when I was surrounded. It was always 5-1, or 8-1, or 12-1, or 20-1. It was fighting for my right to walk down the street literally when a group of men would block my way and say, what are you, a man or a woman? And then it didn't matter what I answered. It was not a literal question. The fact was that if they had to ask, it meant I was someone that they had the right to attack. Well, the Stonewall Rebellion in New York was certainly not the first time that people who were, and here language fails me, gender queer, gender bent. You know, you can only be considered gender bent in a society that's gender rigid. So all of this language that I'm using is hard to express, except that we were masculine females and feminine males, and some of us cross-dressed part of the time and some all of the time, but people could tell we were gender different no matter how we were dressed. And then there were our partners who were highly stylized in their own gender expression and had the courage to be with us. And we would go to the bars and the police would raid them. And sometimes people ask me, and they mean it, I understand the question, they say, well, if the bars were so dangerous, why did you go there? And the fact is that it wasn't that the bars were dangerous and I went there, we went there. It's that where we went was dangerous. That's where the danger came. But even when we were alone, we were fighting, but just one at a time, outnumbered. And so to be together in the bars meant to not be alone, to have some support, to build community. But community didn't stop the raids. Community didn't change the fact that for 364 days a year, I could be arrested for wearing just what I'm wearing now. Now, technically, the law said that female-bodied people had to be wearing 3 pieces of women's clothing, and male-bodied people had to be wearing 3 pieces of men's clothing, or the police could arrest us. The one night a year that we were not arrested, and we all knew this was a fact, was Halloween. But we couldn't explain why. And that contradiction stuck with me. Why on earth didn't the police raid us on Halloween? Was it really just because everyone was in costume? Well, that turned out to be a clue for me that I went back to, but not until things heated up socially to the point where I was in motion too and found my way to other people who were in motion. In New York City, and I'm aware we have a range of ages here, and so I'm going to be, respectful of that when I'm talking about the levels of violence that took place. What happened that night was not unusual in Greenwich Village. It was the Stonewall Inn was a bar that was not a segregated bar. It was black, Latino, and white. That was true, I know, in Buffalo. I can't generalize in other places, but in Buffalo, which is still the 8th most segregated city in the United States, instead of there being apartheid signs on public accommodations or water fountains, the entire city was geographically segregated, east and west along Main Street. However, in the bars and on the shop floors, there was black and white and Haudenosaunee, Six Nation, and Latino together. And that helped shape a different kind of consciousness than was true in the rest of Buffalo, too. And this was true in the Stonewall bar, because some of the bars in Greenwich Village were extremely segregated. I mean, racist segregation. It was like, carding people of color at the door in a way that was meant to bar their entrance, period. Some drag queens were allowed in, some butches were allowed into the Stonewall. It was a very mixed crowd in many ways, around class and nationality and ethnicity and ages, and people had come in from different places because it was sort of located right on subway lines and bus lines, easy to get to from different boroughs. And it was a hot June night, and the police did what they did. They came in for their payoffs. They came in to raid the bars. They took the drag queens and dunked their heads in buckets of water and smeared their makeup on their faces and reminded them that the sentencing could be carried out that night in the back seat of a police cruiser or on the cold cement floor of a precinct cell, and baited them for being limp-wristed sissies. And I handed out for some of you, if you go to workers.org, the series that I've done on lavender and red, I handed this out because I want to be able to refer to things that you can go back and find out more information about, like this Stonewall blow by blow, where I've put together all that happened that night, and it'll, I hope, be interesting for you to read. But basically what happened, by most reports, is that someone who the crowd identified as being a butch lesbian was being dragged out by the police, and she fought. She fought back and struggled, and they tried to get her from the bar into the police cruiser, and she got her feet up against the car and wouldn't get in and was kicking and got away and got back into the bar. And the police went back in and dragged her out, and she fought again, and some of the drag queens said to the crowd, "Do something." And of course, who started it? Who led it? Those who had the least to lose and the most to gain from fighting back. It was mostly the homeless youth who were transgender and gay and lesbian. They were mostly black and Latina and white. Some of them have lived homeless on the streets in New York as transgender youth since they were 10, 11, 12 years old. They knew all about what it meant to be arrested. They still bore the wounds, their bodies and their psyches and their personhood. And they began rocking the police van. They said to the cops, "You can't take our friends away. We're not going to let you." And they took their precious pocket change. People who hadn't eaten that day, they took their pocket change and threw it at the police. They said, "You want your payoffs? Here's your payoffs." And they found bottle caps and bottles and stones, and the police began to retreat. The police, who were so well armed and so aggressive, began to retreat back into the very bar they had raided, because the youth that night taught the police that a stiletto high heel in the hands of an enraged transgender youth is a formidable weapon against police repression. The police barricaded themselves inside the bar, and someone had the foresight to cut the electric and phone lines so they were in there in the dark without backup. And the crowd of youth actually rocked a parking meter and uprooted it out of the concrete sidewalk to try to use it as a battering ram to get in to their oppressors. They tried to burn the bar down with the police inside it. The police stuck guns out, and the youth still wouldn't back away. And that battle lasted almost all night long. And they brought in these tactical SWAT teams, you know, these troops that are just like trained to intimidate and create terror, you know, and they marched to clear the streets. And the youth would just like do can-cans, which was brave, because they were about to get beat. And the cops would get right up to them, and the youth would disappear. Where'd they go? They went around the corner, and suddenly they appeared behind the police. And the police went after them, and they disappeared, and now they were behind them again. They did that all night. This was not a crowd that was intimidated. They were chanting for the first time that anyone could recall hearing in English. They were chanting gay power. Where did that come from? Black power. It was the inspiration of the Black Power movement, of the struggles that were going on at that time. It didn't mean it was the same thing as the black movement. If that was true, then the black drag queens would have the exact same oppression as the white drag queens, and that wasn't true. But it's when one group of people who are oppressed rises up to fight back, it creates room in its wake for other people to say, wait, we could be fighting back too. It leads, literally, it leads the way. And so, for 3 more nights that week, thousands of people came to the village. Black Panthers, white anti-war activists, people of all sexualities and genders, because you could feel something's happening in the village. And it went from being a defensive battle to being an offensive struggle where people basically said the streets belong to the people. These are our streets. And in doing so, they were demonstrating what gay pride was going to look like. But as soon as a movement begins to emerge and shake things up, you get 2 approaches. First, you get suddenly those from on high who have never been our friends before, who come rushing up to say, wait. Don't go too fast. Wait, we're going to show you how to work within the system. And they say, you know, some of these people, you don't want to associate with them in the movement. They're so angry. They're going to discredit your cause. Angry. You know, as though anger against oppression is not a clean burning fuel. They say, well, just take a group of your best educated and most articulate and most well-dressed. Well, you know, right away we should just say, that's just racist, elitist class coding. We know what that means. But they say, you know, if you could just get away from those people who are kind of bringing your struggle down, and they're bringing in all these extraneous things, you know, racism and sexism, and you don't want to mess, just gay rights now. Keep it simple. You know, just one demand, and that'll kind of trickle down, you know. But those of us who have traditionally been trickled on are not real impressed with that strategy. Because here's what happens. They say, well, we're just going to go inside and negotiate for these rights. And kind of like, don't make any noise, you know. Well, they go inside to negotiate, and you can be outside waiting, and they're not coming out. Because the next thing you know, they're the like governor's advisor to this, or they're hoping they're going to get invited to the White House, or they're on this advisory committee. They're finding more affinity with those they're sitting across the table from than the people who they left around the corner. But then there was another current that was the current I was part of that says, wait a minute, we can't throw enough people overboard to be acceptable to our enemies. All we can do is weaken the movement by doing that. I came of age in consciousness, cutting my teeth on the truth that the union movement was built on, that an injury to one is an injury to all, and that a victory for one is a victory for all. And we said, of course we're for gay rights now, but why do we have to, what do you mean all these other demands are watering that down? And like, you ever notice when somebody says that the demand against racism is watering down the demand for gay rights, it's usually a white person who's saying that. You know, somebody else's struggle is watering down theirs. No. We learned on the shop floor that if you want to have a really powerful struggle and win a contract, you've got to get everybody's grievances in that contract. Everybody's got to feel that that contract is defending their life. And then everybody has to defend everything in that contract as though it is their own life, because it is. And that's how we sometimes win. The other way, we never do. You don't automatically win by putting it all together and fighting hard for it, but it's the only way that our current felt it was possible to win. Well, when it came to the left current that I'm talking about of gay liberation, there was those who said that they just wanted it to be gay issues. And we said, what is a gay issue? What is a transgender issue? What is a lesbian issue? Where are the boundaries around it? We're talking about a population of people who are dealing with racism and trying to find a place to live and a job, who are going to jail, who are being drafted, who are disabled, who have children, who have no education and no way to go to school. We're dealing with people who have no health care, who have been prisoners, who are sick and don't have insurance. Like, what's a gay issue? We said, wherever people are struggling against a common oppressor, that's where we got to be. And I don't mean like some quid pro quo, like, well, I'll support you, but first I have to know, I have to ask you a few questions. Like, where do you stand on this and where do you stand on that? No, that's not solidarity. That's a business agreement. I'm talking about the kind of solidarity that said when it's your life that's on the line, when you're struggling, look to the left or the right, and I'll be there. I'll be there, and I will fight for your rights because your life is as precious to me as my own. And I know that if you go down, and I've let that happen, then I'll know they're going to come for me too. And shame on me for not having understood that. So our current said, look, the Black Panther Party is being lined up and shot and framed up. Where are we going to be? Out supporting the Black Panthers. The young lords are facing police repression. Where should gay liberation be? Right at their side, marching with them. In some cities, we didn't just support the great boycott and the lettuce boycott of the United Farm Workers, the Chicano farm workers who were organizing the farms and the factories of fields. We were the boycott committee in some cities. The way now, if you go look at these progressive organizations and struggles and movements, you see so many people who have some LGBT or queer identity who are leading it, but not necessarily in their own names. And you could find us at every demonstration against the war in Vietnam. In fact, we carried, before we had a pride flag, we carried the North Vietnamese flag as our pride flag. Now, you could hear that now and think, well, that's interesting, but it wasn't just an abstract thing. And by the way, I know there's some people who have to leave it for a nursing class here. Nobody's going to look at you funny when you go. I know people are starting to be nervous about, don't worry, you go with our grace. So, the Gay Liberation Front and the Third World Liberation Front named themselves in solidarity with the North Vietnamese people at a time when that was considered treason. That's like now coming out and defending the resistance of the Iraqi people, the Palestinian people, the North Korean people, the Iranian people, the Cuban people. We faced getting beaten up on the streets for marching with the Vietnamese flag, but we knew that if we didn't defend the Vietnamese people, we were going to weaken, first of all, the people who deserved our support because we were the aircraft carrier in which the war was being launched in all our names. We would lose the solidarity with the Vietnamese people, and we would lose our own political soul as a movement as well if we didn't take a position in support. We were supporters on the front lines of the women's liberation movement, even when there were some who didn't want us to be there, who said, oh, if you could just get out of the way because, you know, we're strong women and they're calling us lesbians because you're around. We're like, excuse me, we're withstanding the lesbian baiting. You got to get used to that. As strong women, you better get used to saying, and yes, many of us are, because otherwise you'll just back yourself right off a cliff. And I would ask you, do we have an equal rights amendment today? It was not a winning strategy. We were involved in all these struggles, but not because we said it's going to be a tit for tat. I'll do this if you'll do that. I'll come to your demo Wednesday if you come to mine Thursday. We did it because we knew that it was a fight that we had to join and be a part of. And it strengthened all of us. We learned so much. We learned not just to, not to bury differences, but to celebrate them, to self-educate about them, to be enriched by them, to be enriched by each other's differences in coalition. Because that's what coalition is. It's a coming together of difference and finding a common struggle. But we got so much solidarity in return. Even though we didn't say, I'll do this if you'll do that. And because we didn't say it, we got so much back. You know, shortly after the Stonewall Rebellion, Huey Newton, who was the leader of the Black Panther Party, issued a statement that reverberated in the movement. He said, wherever the forces of black liberation meet, the forces of gay liberation and women's liberation must be there. And shortly after that, the Young Lords Party started an internal gay caucus and a women's caucus. One of the first members of the gay caucus was Sylvia Rivera, the late Sylvia Rivera, who had lived homeless on the streets in New York as a Latina at that time, at transgender youth since she was 10 years old, and was a combatant at Stonewall. And before she died, I said to her, Sylvia, it just drives me crazy when people say to me, now, was Stonewall a gay rebellion or was it a transgender rebellion? And I told her, I just tell them yes. But she said to me, I said, Sylvia, what do you say? I said, what would you say if somebody says to you, did you fight back that night because you were gay, because you were self-identified drag queen, because of police brutality, because you were a sex worker, you had to turn tricks in order to survive, because you were homeless, because you knew what it meant to go to jail, because you didn't have a draft card when they demanded it that night? And I'll never forget her answer. It was so succinctly elegant and eloquent. She said, we were fighting for our lives. And the fact is that oppressions overlap in people's lives, as they do in this room. There are people in this room who are carrying heavier burdens of discrimination and oppression. There are people who have more dreams that have been deferred. There are people who have less opportunities, more doors slammed in their face. And that was true at Stonewall, too. There were people who were homeless, and there were people who had homes to go to. There were people who had eaten that day, and people who hadn't eaten for several days. But the fact is that when they all came together, shoulder to shoulder, to fight back against a common oppressor that night, they made history. Not in spite of their differences, but because they came to understand the need to fight together against a common enemy. And that was the most important lesson of the Stonewall Rebellion for so many of us, was the power of what we could do when we came together. Now, we were also, as I said, a part of the anti-war movement. And I want to bridge from that backward, because every single movement for change in a period of colonial or imperialist war is either strengthened or derailed on the question of that war. There's like no place to sit out a war. There's no neutral place. There's no fence that you can sit on. It's always a barricade. And our movement in the 60s and the early 70s really gained tremendous dynamism from the statements that you'll find if you go back and look at Lavender and Red, at the statements that Third World Liberation Front, the Gay Liberation Front, and other militants at that time were saying, wherever people are struggling, the people of Asia, of Africa, of Latin America, poor people, impoverished people, there's a war internationally and there's a war domestically, and we know whose side we're on. We're on the side of the oppressed everywhere. That was the strength of that movement. That was our dynamism. That was our forward momentum. But there was an earlier gay, trans women's movement that was also asked that same question. Where are you going to stand? Well, you know, I'm trying to get rid of any ableist language from my vocabulary. I'm trying to get rid of anything that says you have to be able to stand or walk or talk or see or hear in order to be brave or strong or do the right thing or courageous or strong even. But this was the German homosexual emancipation movement, which you'll also find in this Lavender and Red series more information about, because I'm not trying to gloss over these things historically. But this was a movement that arose in Germany around the 1800s, the late 1800s, and was becoming really a burgeoning movement in the 1900s, the early part of that century, until World War I was on the horizon. And here they were. They had the support of a workers' movement that was out in the streets, that had revolutionary leadership. The best of that leadership was supporting the gay emancipation movement, which was also a trans movement and allied with the women's movement at that time. I mean, it had real strength, real potential. And then came World War I, and the leadership surrendered to patriotism. They wouldn't come out against the war. And you could imagine how they would rationalize that to each other. Oh, you know, we're doing so well, and we don't want to get isolated, and it's not really a gay issue, and, you know, we got to show we're really patriotic and that we support the troops. Sound familiar, you know? And the fact was that the strength of that movement had been that it was independent of its own rulers, and it was telling its rulers, this is what we demand. We demand that you repeal this draconian law against same-sex love. But the minute it surrendered to the establishment, its own rulers, and said, oh, but we support you when it comes to this racist colonial war for empire, go ahead and carry it out in our names, they lost their movement. They lost it. And you know what happens. Those who are the most progressive and revolutionary got isolated. Those who were the most reactionary began to walk a little taller and get a little more emboldened. And the next thing you know, the tank treads of that kind of Rambo mentality just rolled right over the movement. And it took years and a new leadership from the Russian Revolution to breathe life back into the movement with a new leadership, so that in 1918, during the brief November Revolution, while the bullets were still flying overhead, the young revolution gave Prince Hatzfeld's mansion over to the German homosexual emancipation movement for what was the first sexual archives, like the first LGBT community center that I know of in history. The point of this to me is, from World War I and from the Vietnam War, the war against Vietnam, is that we have to take a position on the war. It doesn't matter whether our struggles are economic or social in character, whether it's for economic justice, for jobs or education or health care or housing, whether it's for AIDS funding or breast cancer research. Well, the cities are being starved to pay for the war. Everywhere I go in this country, you can see the downtowns beginning to get more and more run down and shuttered, and the foreclosure signs, which are not just because of the banks right now, it's because people can't afford to live. They can't cobble together enough. People are working 2 or 3 jobs. Tens of millions of people born in the U.S. don't have health care insurance, and we don't know how many millions of undocumented workers who are contributing billions to the economy have no health care insurance or can't go to a hospital emergency room for fear of being torn away from their families and forcibly deported. So Whether this struggle is against rape or battering, for youth rights, the right to decent jobs and not have to go kill or be killed, the looming draft, the ROTC marching around on campus and trying to recruit high schoolers with frisbees and video games, you know, whether it's for the right of gender expression, people's right to find the sex that is their home and live it and be respected in it, be respected for our love for each other. Well, all of this right now is in a period of such racism and such reaction from above that it has to be confronted head on. Otherwise, if we don't as movements if we don't find a way to express our own independent demands of our own rulers, then we would suffer the same fate as the German movement did. For example, remember the excuse that the U.S. used to invade and bomb the people of Afghanistan? Women's liberation. Remember, I actually heard Laura Bush. They gave her husband's radio program to get on, and Laura Bush actually said the words women's liberation. I shivered. To hear her talk about women's liberation is just like this appeal. We have got to take back the struggle for women's liberation and define it for ourselves. The Bushes are talking about it now. And what are they saying? March with us. March to go enslave the people of Afghanistan. But you know, it's not popular. It's not popular for Halliburton and big oil and the banks and the military-industrial complex to say, come, bring us your youth. Let us send them to kill or be killed for other people who have their own dreams and their own lives and culture and history, and go kill them if they don't toe the line and do what we say with our globalization. Who would sign up for that? It's always a humanitarian effort, as though the Pentagon were a Meals on Wheels, this great vehicle of women's liberation. They said, look, the Taliban is not good to women. Well, now, first of all, there are women soldiers who are dying, U.S. soldiers who are dying in Kuwait right now, in the desert, who are deployed, because they're not drinking water all day, because they're afraid to go to the latrines at night for fear of being raped by their officers. So please, you know, nobody has inculcated rape into the mentality of its military more than the Pentagon. But let's look for a moment at how they try to take the question of same-sex love or gender expression or women's liberation out of any kind of social or economic or historical context in order to do this. Yes, the U.S. knows exactly what the condition was for women in Afghanistan under the Taliban. In fact, the Afghan people had made a democratic revolution against feudalism in which they tried to liberate women. And the gains of that revolution are documented by the U.S. Army in its own manuals for those years. You can actually go online and look at the U.S. Army manuals, and it'll say they abolished the bride price, women had names for the first time, they had jobs, they became teachers, the literacy rates went up. So what did the U.S. do? They went in and they armed the militia of the landlords, some of the same people now that they say they have to go to war against. They were arming then against the revolution that was taking that geostrategic part of the world out of their direct control. And they drowned it in blood. And then when the Taliban came to power, Unocal, which is the big oil and natural gas transnational corporation, tried to sign a deal with some hard terms. And some of the Taliban were reluctant to sign on the dotted line. And so the summer before 9/11, months before 9/11, Unocal is documented as saying through the U.S., sign or we will invade you and we will carry out a regime change. And they did. And now who have they installed as the titular president of Afghanistan? Hamid Karzai, who is a former UNICAL executive. And who was their first U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan? Another former UNICAL executive. So here's a whole segment of leadership from the old second wave women's liberation who are saying, yes, bomb Afghanistan in order to liberate women. There's that split again. They see it just as a women's issue, and they saw it completely out of context of the way our lives and our struggles and our bodies and the lives and bodies and struggles of Afghan women and men and other sexualities were being manipulated. Now, they never say, remember the weapons of mass destruction? Oops, there were no weapons. Well, it's too late for the Iraqi people. It's too late to take these Gulf of Tonkin incidents and these sinking of the Lusitania and sinking of the Maine, all these pretexts for war, for empire. It's too late later to say, and you know, it turned out it wasn't true. Of course it's not true. First of all, the U.S. and Britain aren't looking to liberate anybody. They're looking to re-enslave people who have kicked them out and are trying to defend their own sovereignty and self-determination. And second of all, the U.S. and Britain have no business going to fix anybody's culture. There's enough to be fixed right here, and they're not the ones that are going to do it. We are. The fact is that every time now the U.S. and Britain and the EU in general are starting to menace Iran, look at the LGBT presses and see if there isn't an article talking about some pogrom against gay people in Iran. Now, I have searched very hard in research, and you'll find that if you go to workers.org and type in pogrom. But the fact is, I can't find a pogrom, and it's a hell of a word to be using, to be throwing around carelessly. You know, it's always like everybody's the new Hitler, and everything's the new pogrom, you know, to try to like whip up the population again, that this is the good war, this is the humanitarian effort. The fact is, the Iranian culture is 5 millennia old. And the U.S. and Britain have already carried out a regime change in Iran. And the people there remember it. They've all either lost somebody in their family from it, or they remember the years of the torture and the terror. Because when they had their own elected government of Mossadegh, the U.S. and the Britain carried out their own little coup and regime change and installed not a great democratic leader, but a king, the Shah of Iran, on the peacock throne, and trained the Savak. The CIA trained them in torture techniques. And the Iranian people lived with the terror and the torture of years of that regime change, and were able to kick them out again. And 26 years later, 27 years later, you'll see these articles saying that it's been just hell for the Iranian people for 27 years. So the U.S. and Britain have to go in and overthrow. The Iranian people have elected their government, unlike the one we have here, that was appointed. How dare they talk about going to Iran to defend gay rights? First of all, it's trying to take the rainbow flag and just impose it all over the world, as though it's just one thing. And the movement picks this up too. People in the movement pick it up too, particularly white activists. It's like, if everybody in the world doesn't look and identify the same way as those who are marching in the Castro in San Francisco or in Greenwich Village in New York, they're in the closet. Or it's a homophobic culture, or they're not out yet. But the fact is that everywhere in the world, there are histories of different forms of sexual and social and economic organization that have produced different forms of gender expression, different sexes than are accepted in this society. And everything that we hear about those societies has to be translated, literally, either into English or translated as concepts. So the U.S. and Britain can say, oh, look how progressive it is here for LGBT people? Well, yes, because we fought like hell for it. And the fact is that it can be overturned at any point that we stop fighting for it, the way it was in Germany, or the way it was here during the McCarthyite witch hunt. But here's the part they don't say, that it was colonialism and imperialism that brought anti-sodomy laws all over the world. If you go to India or Thailand, you'll see the same Section 377 against same-sex love with punishments. And why? Because that was the British law. The British brought that, just like the British brought it to Africa, to the Caribbean. The Spanish brought it to Latin America. The U.S., when it invaded Puerto Rico, they just took the same law they had here in California, and they just copied it word for word. It became the new law in occupied Puerto Rico. They brought it to Cuba, all over this hemisphere. And I want you to think about that. Every time you see an ad for this movie, Apocalypto, by Mel Gibson, you know, he's like the Leni Riefenstahl was for German Capital, you know, as a filmmaker. It's not just when he gets drunk that this stuff comes out. It's when he's sober, too. See, what's the movie about? It's about a small hunting gathering, a small family from a hunting gathering society. And it's about the Mayan culture at the point where it was beginning to expand into an early imperial empire, right? So it's how the Mayan culture looked from the standpoint of the hunter-gatherers being chased by them. And then finally, after the unrelenting terror in which Mayans are made out to be just inherently bloodthirsty, who comes to save the day on the horizon? Spanish colonialism, flying the cross on its flags. Civilization is there to save the day. Now, this is quite a propaganda film, considering, first of all, it's about Mayans at a time when Mexicano people and Chicano people are being completely demonized by the Lou Dobbs of the country, who are trying to make it seem like they're the enemy within. There's a war against immigrants in this country, and this is war propaganda for that. You know, it's racist as all hell. It's also coming at a time when the U.S. has replaced the claim that it's taking civilization to the rest of the world and is saying it's bringing democracy to the rest of the world. That's the spin now, right? But the fact is that it was colonialism and imperialism that were the real apocalyptos. You know, now that the child who was in the room is not here, just to give you one example, in Cuba, when the Spanish colonialists came, they used the fact that the indigenous peoples of the island, before the Holocaust of the Middle Passage, they tried to justify the enslavement of indigenous people by the fact that they had a different system of sexuality than the Spanish colonialists did. And so those who were accused of having same-sex love, the male-bodied people, the colonialists actually cut off their testicles and rolled them in the dirt and forced them to eat them. I'm sorry to repeat this, but when I say that they brought this, you know, in the belly of their armadas, I mean literally, they brought the Inquisition. They brought this terror, and they tried to restructure societies. You know, in order to facilitate economic exploitation, they restructured violently the kinship systems, the social systems, the gendered systems. They outlawed and mandated sexuality and the roles of women and men and how many sexes there could be. And now they say, gee, things aren't so great in all these countries for gay people and women. Let us go reinvade and fix it. We have to be able to have a historical view for this. And to understand, too, I think that people in other countries who may be same-sex, oppressed based on their sexuality or their gender expression or their sex, don't need to be defended against their own people and their own cultures and their own populations in order to have solidarity with us. It's just the opposite. We need to be able to defend their right to their entire people's right to self-determination and sovereignty. I just came back from Palestine, where I was able to be invited to the first Arabic conference of Palestinian lesbians, bisexual, intersexual, and transgender. And it was inspiring. It was inspiring. The whole conference was in Arabic. And it was to celebrate 5 years of doing work within the Palestinian communities and the publication of a book in Arabic to reach out to their own population in their own language about same-sex love. Now, it was the British mandate that brought anti-sodomy laws to Palestine. And it was the French mandate that brought it to Lebanon, where Helem, the LGBT Lebanese group, is fighting to try to overturn that colonial law. One of the things that the Arab women were saying at this conference is, don't tell us that your solidarity is based on the fact that, oh, you're so brave to be Palestinians. You know, don't defend us against our own people and our own culture. Defend our Palestinian struggle for self-determination and sovereignty, and let us do our own internal work within our own population. That's the way to defend us. So that's what I want to raise as putting on our agenda, not as like a quick fix, we talk about it here and that's it, but just the opposite, that we put this on the agenda for more discussion and more thought, and be able to pay attention to each other on this to figure out the way forward, is to develop a kind of grassroots diplomacy, a kind of solidarity that we build with people around the world that we've been told, that we've been pitted against, or that we've been told need to be saved from their own cultures, their own struggles. And instead try to figure out how to articulate together a kind of grassroots solidarity that says, look, we know that the same government, the same military, the same corporations that are attacking you are making our lives harder and harder to live and more unbearable. And we are going to defend you. We are going to stop everybody knows that the question is not if the U.S. wants to attack Iran, but when, just like it did with Iraq. And we've got to be able to say the Iranian people are not our enemies. And people will hear that around the world. They will hear it and realize that there is a difference between the people of the U.S. and the government and the corporations and the banks that carry this out in all our names. One of the ways we do this is through the anti-war movement. It's got to be, because like I said, no matter what struggle we're involved in, it's tied with 1,000 threads to a war of this character. Where do we politically stand on this war is the question that is going to define our current, which is going to be the strongest current in the movement. In addition, I want to ask those of you who are interested afterwards to see me about a campaign that's an initiative that's taking off in order to bring more understanding in the U.S. about the Cuban Five. Could I ask you if you'd raise your hand if you've ever heard of the Cuban Five? And raise your hand if you haven't heard of the Cuban Five. Okay. 5 Cubans, well, a number of Cubans were sent here to infiltrate the CIA commando groups that are carrying out, planning attacks on Cuba. You know, they've blown up airliners and killed people. They've bombed hotels, etc., on the island. They got the information about this guy like Posada Carriles, who was just released, this terrorist who was just released by the U.S. They found out where the attacks were being planned, and the Cuban government gave the information to the FBI and said, these attacks are being planned from U.S. soil, and we want you to stop these attacks. Well, instead of stopping them, the FBI figured out from the information who had infiltrated, and so they arrested them. And the Cuban Five are now 5 political prisoners being held in different jails, prisons around the country, some of them on life sentences, for the crime of trying to stop terror attacks being carried out by a government that claims it's waging war against people around the world in the name of fighting terrorism. That's why so many people in this room haven't heard about them. It blows the lid off the hypocrisy of the U.S. war drive right now. but also these 5 Cubans are in jail. They're facing life sentences. Their kids, their families, their loved ones can't get in to see them, or some haven't seen them at all. Some see them very rarely, only when there's been a struggle. And so, because there's been such an effort by the CIA in particular, thank you, by the CIA in particular over the decades to drive a division between the LGBT movement in this country and the Cuban Revolution, we don't hear about what's going on the island. There's a political blockade as well as an economic blockade. And there's been so many developments for transgender and transsexual and homosexual Cubans on the island, and we don't know about it. We don't know about what's happened for women on the island, what a revolutionary process can mean when a people who have faced 450 years of colonialism and imperialism take over their economy and provide free education and free health care and free rent and subsidized utilities for everybody on the island, and engage in a debate about how to move forward, and people have mass participation and the right to say about how their communities organized and how their factories organized. We don't know about those things. So one of the things that the Lavender and Red series is doing is I'm taking up step by step everything that's happened in Cuba since 1959 on the question of sexuality and gender and sex, and putting it back in the context of this struggle. And you can read this online, because I don't want to, like I said, I don't want to gloss over any of it. I spend more time on the problems than on the advances on all of this, because it's the problems we have to be able to answer and understand so that we're not demoralized. But a multilingual, multinational group of LGBT activists in the U.S. put out a call for rainbow solidarity for the Cuban Five. And the people of Cuba heard it right away. Right away, it broke through the blockade. And the word came back, when you defend the Cuban Five, you're defending people of all sexualities in Cuba, because the Five were defending all of us from terror attacks. So for those who are interested in signing up for the Rainbow Solidarity to free the Cuban Five, please see me after this event, and I have some information. And if there are people who can help on the cyber aspect of this campaign, of getting the information out about it, please see me afterward. But this amazing thing happened. It's about solidarity. It's not just another, like a Write Your Congressperson campaign. It so captured people's imagination that 3 weeks after the first call went out, people from 45 countries had signed up. The national organization Pro-Gay Philippines signed up. And it's all 3 national transsexual Italian organizations signed on. And Angela Davis signed on. And Alison Bechtel, the lesbian cartoonist. And Stephen Funk, the Filipino first GI to refuse to go to the Iraq War, signed. I mean, 1,000 people signed. And it's been translated now into more than 16 languages. It's in Farsi and Spanish and simplified and traditional Chinese. It's in Croatian. It's in Italian and Spanish and French. And it's in all these languages. It's being translated into Urdu, into Bengali, into Swahili. And we're trying to get it into a sign language, American Sign Language, video version. People around the world are volunteering to translate it into, somebody just volunteered today to translate it into the Indonesian language, which of course is going to be big, because there's so many sexualities and genders in Indonesia that will respond to this. And lastly, there's the question of May 1st and the solidarity with undocumented workers. I talked about the solidarity that came back to the gay liberation movement, but this one I saved, which is the United Farm Workers and Cesar Chavez. Last summer, here in California, when the predominantly Latino union, the UFW, the United Farm Workers, took a very principled position in support of same-sex marriage rights. And Cesar Chavez's granddaughter, Christine Chavez, recalled to the media how proud her grandfather was to be a supporter of the gay liberation struggle early on, and how he not only went to the gay liberation demonstrations, he'd say to the other workers, come on with me. And he'd bring them with, and he'd say, bring the flags, bring the black and red flags of the UFW. And how proud he was to be on the lead banner, carrying the lead banner at the 1979 lesbian and gay demonstration in Washington, D.C. That's the kind of spirit of solidarity that I'm talking about. And you know, when I'm talking about immigrant workers, I also want to raise what's happening right now to South Asian and Muslim and Arab workers in this country. Because I don't know how it is for you here, but I live in Jersey City, which has maybe now surpassed LA for being the largest immigrant population per capita in the U.S. But it's a very multinational city. And we all know of Muslim and South Asian and Arab workers who are just disappearing. They're just disappearing on their way home from work. And everybody knows they're either been forcibly detained and are being tortured somewhere, or they're in detention and being tortured here. There's one guy they admitted that they had who had disappeared, and the Jersey Journal said, oh, well, he died in custody, but he died of a tooth infection. Well, easy to say. He's, in their custody, and he's dead now. He can't speak for himself. And his family said, we didn't know where he was, and they said, well, actually, he asked us not to tell you. He asked us not to tell his family or his embassy where he was. For those who ask, how could Japanese Americans have been rounded up and interned in camps here in California and Arizona and other states during the war? This is how it looks when it begins. When we're defending immigrant workers on May 1st, we have to be defending Arab and South Asian and Muslim workers too, who are being, part of this. I don't even call it racial profiling. It's just plain racist profiling. And it's a justification, a pretext for this war. So on May 1st, like I said when I began, if I was here, this is where I'd be. But instead, I'll be in New York City, marching from coast to coast. And I say, if there's something we could do that would help give vitality and dynamism and momentum to all of our struggles, economic and social, gender, sexuality, against racism, for jobs and education and healthcare and housing, the best way that we can breathe life into it is to be there in support of undocumented workers when they're marching in the streets on May 1st, to be able to demonstrate that solidarity. In fact, if immigrant workers lose their driver's licenses under the Real ID Act, I will lose my driver's license too, because my ID doesn't match. My birth certificate and my passport and my driver's license don't match, and that makes me a felon. And I could go to jail for 10 years. But you know what? Even if I wasn't affected by it, I'd be out there marching on May 1st. Because I know that an injury to one is an injury to all, and a victory for one is a victory for all. So I say, all out on May 1st, si se puede. Thank you.